Okay, we're in part 2, chapter 4. And we're up to paragraph 6. We're finishing the chapter. So, as we said yesterday, the original creation of mankind, which essentially is two people, Adam and Chava, they carried an identity which today we would call Jewish. They had all 630 commandments. They were the definition of mankind as God intended mankind to be. Had they succeeded in their challenge, that would have been the end of creative history, and further developments would have led directly and necessarily to the world to come. They failed. They were expelled from the Garden of Eden. The whole world deteriorated. The whole world became degraded. Now, the new project was, in this newly degraded world, to divide up the challenge of creating human perfection among thousands, millions, billions of slices of humanity, each in his own context, each with his own abilities, and then complete the job piecemeal, and then reintegrate those slices into humanity as a single entity. All of the creative energy now is to be expended in this new world. Once that's finished, there's a return to the status of Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, and then the progress through that status to the ultimate perfection, but that progress is guaranteed. All the effort is done here. Now, this left the world in a degraded state. So, God set up a condition for a period of time where any individual and all people together could have, by their efforts, achieved a position which, the way I put it last time was, which would have represented the Gan Eden reality in this world. No, you couldn't get back to Gan Eden. That can't happen until after death and the destruction of the body and all the rest. But you have a world in which there is given nothing of the Garden of Eden, and then there's a potentiality within this world to do something that expresses a principle like the Garden of Eden, though not exactly. And the example that I gave you was the difference between democracy in Athens, which was a direct democracy, where all the citizens got together on occasion and voted on what the policies of government should be, everyone, one by one, with simple majority rule, versus representative democracy. No one's dreaming of direct democracy anymore. There are lots of reasons for that, some reasons of principle, not just practicalities. So you have representative democracy. You have elections from time to time, and then your representatives make the laws. That's not exactly the same. Indeed, the representatives could do something, and 98% of the population could be against it. Too bad. They make the law is law. And the fact that you have a survey that says that, it's like protests against now about the latest Supreme Court decision. It's undemocratic because most Americans are against it. Excuse me. You don't know how to spell democratic. There are laws, and the laws were enacted by people, and they could be changed by democratic means. And in the meantime, those are the laws, and when they make a decision, that decision is the law. And the fact that you don't like it, too bad. But if you compare, let's say, Western representative democracies with the Soviet Union, with China, with other countries in the world, they don't have a hint of democracy. There's nothing like democracy in their whole polity. In the West, you have an expression of the idea that power belongs to the people, and people should have the ultimate control and the ultimate say, just not in the same way as before. So here too, in the world after the expulsion from the Garden of Eden, there was an opportunity to recover something of the Garden of Eden reality, to express it in this world. Not the same, but yes, as an expression of that same principle. Anybody and everybody could have done it. It could have been uniform. Only Abraham did it. After that, there was the 70 nations. Any nation or part of a nation could have removed itself from its national identity and joined the Jewish people. That was the third opportunity. The fourth opportunity, we said, was when the Torah was given to the Jewish people. Every nation was offered the Torah, and don't make a mistake, in addition to the Jewish people, not instead of. It wasn't, do we have another volunteer? It was an opportunity for all mankind to receive the Torah simultaneously. And every nation said no, except for the Jewish people. That was the fourth opportunity to make mankind uniform, with no distinctions. After that, it's no longer an opportunity for a mass elevation of the world or homogenization of the world, but every individual has the opportunity and the alternative of joining the Jewish people, and the ideal resolution would be that they should all do so. We have no principle that there should be two tiers of humanity, an upper tier and a lower tier, the elite and the plebes. We have no such principle. There's not a Jewish principle. Yeah.
Wasn't there such time in history where no conversions weren't allowed?
Yes, there were times in history when no conversions were allowed because at those times you could not ascertain the sincerity of the person who was applying to become a convert. This was during the time of King David and King Solomon. King David established a great kingdom. Solomon not only had a big, by our terms, kingdom, and wealthy kingdom, but his understanding, his wisdom was appreciated by everyone. How could you ascertain that the person wanted to attach himself to God rather than just become a member of a very influential and impressive culture? Who says it had anything religious about it? Indeed, I read a book about the history of Rome, and they said that many of the myths, which we regard as myths of their religion, they also didn't believe. They pledged allegiance to the religion because it was a religion of Rome. And Rome had an empire. That was worthwhile. That was a good move. Like, for example, there are places where there are Reformed Jewish congregations in the United States where many of the members and participants are not Jews. And the reason why they participate is because it's good to get to know Jews. It's good for business. It's good for opportunities. They're doing well, the Jews. So it's a worthwhile thing to do. So it was very difficult to know, and for that reason, I think it may be universal that when the Mashiach comes, we will not accept converts anymore. If King David, King Solomon made it questionable, so then that would make it impossible to ascertain. And this is not a joke. Even in our times, my wife runs a seminary, and she knows of a case. She knows the people where a woman converted to Judaism and married a guy with the expectation of certain style of life, and they were married. And they had several children, and he did not provide the style of life that she was expecting, and so she went back to being a Christian. She gave it up. And I wouldn't necessarily accuse her of lying. She may have believed she was sincere. She may have thought that she was doing it for sincere purposes. She discovered herself through the trials of being a Jewish married to him that it wasn't a sincere attachment to God. It was rather a desire for a Jewish lifestyle. Yeah.
You said Abraham was the only one to reach that state of being the full expression of what the next world is, but like in davening we say Zocheh always meaning Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. So positions Yitzchak and Yaakov reach to. Yeah, no, but Abraham was the only one who reached it on his own. Yitzchak was Abraham's son. He had it delivered to him, right? Right. And there were other people, Shem and Aver, other people who knew the truth and even who preached the truth to others, but that wasn't enough. That wasn't enough. Abraham's career was unique. He risked his life, and okay. All right, so that's the situation we got up to. Now, he says, so where do we sit today? Well, the fact that the nations of the world or the whole of humanity 3 times anyway, after the Gan Eden rebuffed HaKadosh Baruch Hu's efforts and offer, doesn't mean that they would be discreet, they'd be destroyed. No. They obviously weren't destroyed. And they do have a soul. Something like the soul of the Jewish people, but at a different level. So I think you'd have to say that qualitatively they're very similar, but quantitatively they are different. After all, non-Jews have free will, non-Jews have commandments, non-Jews have reward and punishment. So that's the essential stamp of humanity. But there's an expression of that soul, which is going to discuss on the next page, which is tied to the 613 commandments. And they have, now he says 7, and that's the word you hear all the time, that the non-Jews have 7 commandments. Actually, it's a bit misleading. If you take our 613, so there are about 65 of those that apply to non-Jews. But it's, approximately 10%. If you don't have the whole complement of 613, then there's a certain aspect of the challenge to humanity which they're not facing. And that has consequences. Now he says, in the world to come, even though non-Jews can, by following their commandments in the appropriate fashion, be admitted into the world to come, the only nation that will be there is the Jewish nation. And the others will come in as adjuncts, as secondary to the Jewish nation. This raises a very, very important question. What is a nation? Why is a national identity important? I think because we're infested, corrupted by Western ideas, especially Western political theory, we think of the idea of a nation as accidental. Just a conglomeration of people living in close proximity, and they decide to cooperate with one another, where the authority of the government is due to the consent of the governed. And then some people have a theory of implicit consent, but it's the consent of the government that gives the government its authority. Without that, it's an illegitimate government. That means that the only objective feature that makes a group of people into a nation is common interest. And the decision to cooperate on pursuing a common interest. Nothing essential to nationhood other than that. Well, that's certainly not the Jewish picture. And if he says that in the old world to come, there is national identity is important, and the only nation there is the Jewish nation, and those who didn't join the Jewish nation can get in as individuals, but they don't have that additional aspect of identity called national identity, then something important is going on. And part of what's going on is this, that the Jewish people and individual Jews live on 2 different levels. Let's take, for example, a person playing the violin. There are pieces of music for violin solo. Bach wrote wonderful partitas for violin solo. But a violin solo is one thing, and a violin playing in an orchestra is something else. Because the violins in an orchestra have to play together with all the other pieces. They have to keep time with all the other pieces. Sometimes they play loudly, and sometimes they have to play softly because they're playing background for what other pieces are playing, other instruments are playing. So although the violin is an individual instrument and can play solo, sometimes it functions as an element in a much larger group, and that group has a unified project of which this violin is a part. That concept of its taking on the identity of a violin part in a Beethoven symphony
is something which the modern concept of nationhood, especially those who articulate it the way I described in terms of consent and the rest and practical outcome, have no counterpart. Now there are people who they understand the concept of nation more richly than what I described, even in the Western world. I don't do that because I'm an American. And Americans don't do that. We stand for something. We stand for something. I'm proud to be an American. That's not the sentiment of someone who needs to build a dam, and there are lots of people around, and building a dam is a big project, so we better all get together and cooperate. There's something much more than that. Their nation expresses a set of values, an ideology, a set of principles. So that's closer to our concept of a nation. Now, different people or groups in the nation are given descriptions in our literature which emphasize this kind of integration. The Sanhedrin is called Einei Ha'eda, the eyes of the congregation, meaning they do what eyes do. They gather essential information, they enable you to evaluate, and they feed the information that you use to make decisions on. The king is called the heart of the nation in our literature. The heart pumps sustenance to all the limbs of the nation. The king is the one who's responsible to see that everything is functioning, everything develops, everything grows, everything interacts with everything else. The heart pumps oxygen to the whole body, without which things in the body would die. So when you ask, what is this person doing, you're going to get two answers. You can ask what he's doing as an individual, but that doesn't exhaust his identity. His identity is also part of playing a role in a nation. So that means when you talk about a person, you have to carry both elements of his identity together. Otherwise, you don't have a picture of what a person is, in our term of what a person is. I'll give you an illustration of this in a halacha, which is brought out beautifully by the commentators. The Gemara states, the Gemara asks the following question. I'll just give you an example. It's Friday night. And I'm at home with my family and my guests. I make Kiddush. The custom is one person makes Kiddush. Some people have the custom. And everybody else listens. And they satisfy their obligation. Then you wash, you make hamotzi, and start the meal. Then there's a knock on the door. Open the door. There's a Jew standing there, and he says, I haven't fulfilled the mitzvah of Kiddush tonight yet. Please do me a favor and make Kiddush for me. Yeah. But look, how does it work when I make Kiddush for someone? The explanation, there are several, but the one explanation we're using here is this. I make Kiddush, I do the mitzvah, people listen to me, and by listening to me do the mitzvah, they satisfy their obligation also. But now, this is a once a week mitzvah. I did it already. Next time is 7 days from now. He wants me to make Kiddush for him. I can't do that. Because if I'll say the words over again, I'm not making Kiddush again. I'm just play acting. I'm just pronouncing Hebrew words. So I should say to him, I'm awfully sorry. It's just, you're asking me for an impossibility. But the Gemara says I do it anyway. Well, why is that? So Rashi says, because every Jew is responsible for every other Jew. You can't turn your back on another Jew. The fact that he needs it means you have to help him. But Rashi's answer doesn't completely explain, because I could say, I hear you, Rashi. I hear you. Listen, I'll give him his own cup of wine. I'll give him a transliterated text. I'll say the words that he can repeat after me. I'll help him. I'm not abandoning him. I care for him. But I have a legal problem. I can't say the words for him, because when you do that, you're supposed to be doing the mitzvah. And I'm not doing the mitzvah because I did it already. Says the Ran, elaborating on Rashi's explanation, the Ran says, as long as there is a single Jew in the world, anywhere, who has not fulfilled the mitzvah of Kiddush, every Jew has a responsibility to make Kiddush for him. Meaning that my mitzvah of Kiddush this week is not finished. It's not a one-time job. The mitzvah is inherently social. The mitzvah is, Jews need Kiddush, do it. How many times? 10 times, 20 times. Makes absolutely no difference. As long as there are Jews who need to do it, it's my mitzvah to do it for them. That's how the Ran elaborates on Rashi. And the Ritva elaborates on the Ran using the language I just told you. The Ritva says the new Jewish people is one corporate entity. And that means that if the left hand has an infection, the right hand cannot be indifferent because there's one bloodstream joining them all. Because there's some things you can only do with two hands. And if the left hand has an infection, the right hand can't do it alone. So the right hand is crippled by the fact that the left hand has infection. It's all one integrated entity. That's how one can do for the other, just as the right hand will put the bandage on the left hand that has the infection. So this idea of a corporate identity is something that is an essential element of Jewish thinking in terms of what a nation is, and there are many halachos. That depend upon it. So, since that's part of the essential identity of a Jew, and since the identity of a Jew is the identity with which a person lives out what God wants done in the world, what we're being told is an essential part of your spiritual identity is this connection to the other people in a nation where you share a collective identity. And there are many elements of this. When you get used to, as I hope you will, davening 3 times a day, and you daven with a minyan, you will find that a challenge. Because no minyan is perfect for the taste of everyone davening there. It's a little too fast, a little too slow, a little too loud, a little too soft, and he's from Hungary with a Hungarian pronunciation. And where you can't tell it, he says he for male and female. They're both he. And other things like that. Or like a Sephardi would say, those poor Ashkenazim, an aleph and an ayin, they don't do string. It's 2 different letters with 2 different sounds. So they say, So that means, what's your attitude? What a pain in the neck. You don't have to put up with this. No. This is a spiritual exercise. Because davening with a minyan is a different prayer from davening alone. Everyone is necessary to make the minyan. And that means accepting and adapting and identifying with a group, not all of whose performance is ideal for you as a separate individual, is part of the spiritual exercise. You're not just looking for comfort, even spiritual comfort. So that's just an introduction to the idea of a national identity. And that's why he says in the world to come, there will be a national identity. And those who didn't join the Jewish nation, there are no other nations. The others are just scattered individuals, even if all the Chinese come. But they can't form a nation because they don't form a nation like this. And that being the case, their non-Jewish status will carry through to their position in the world to come. Yeah, we're together? Okay, now, the final thing he explains here, what is it that the 630 commandments do that the 7 categories, or the 65 commandments of non-Jews don't do? Well, there's a project, and the project is to spiritualize the whole of creation. We speak of the world to come. We don't mean souls, even though that was Maimonides' view, but that's not what Ramchal means, and the vast majority of opinions means. Not just souls. It's not just souls plus bodies. It's souls plus bodies, plus the earth, plus the galaxies, plus the mosquitoes, everything. The project of the 630 commandments is to spiritualize everything and prepare everything for being incorporated into the world to come. Now, incorporation requires transformation. The mosquitoes won't bite. You won't get welts from mosquito bites. But everything that God created plays and plays continuously a role in the perfection process, and therefore it's included in the final result. The 630 commandments touch every aspect of creation. The sum total of performing those mitzvos has an effect on every aspect of creation and enables it to be elevated and perfected. The 7 categories of mitzvos that non-Jews perform don't do that.
They don't do that. They have an effect on their own spirituality, which I would say is almost true by definition. And yeah, he doesn't really say this in the English. I don't know why not. He says what they do can improve or damage their state, whether in the body or in the soul, and can strengthen or weaken the control of the body over the soul, or the soul over the body, but that's all. They're only their physical and spiritual condition themselves, but that's all. Now, the final thing that he says here, I have to understand, is that one other difference between the position of the Jewish people in the world versus the non-Jews is that the non-Jews belong to nations, their concept of nation, and each of their nations has a heavenly director in charge of their affairs. Whereas the Jewish people, he puts it now in broad terms, and I'll explain to you a little bit of the details in a moment. The Jewish people don't have a heavenly director. They have only the providence of the Creator himself. That's one point. And the second point is that we enjoy, therefore, providence concerning the details of our lives, whereas they have providence concerning their general conditions, but not the details of their lives. That's what he says. Now, these statements, these bold statements, are apt to be greatly misunderstood. So let me explain a little detail for each statement. The phrase in the Gemara is Ein mazel Yisrael. The Jewish people doesn't have mazel. Now, if you speak colloquial Jewish, that means, oy, our investments go down, and we don't hit home runs, and things just go badly. There's no mazel. But mazel has a technical term, and that is a heavenly force, usually conceived of as an angel, whose job it is to oversee the affairs of a nation, and that heavenly force, that angel, stands between God and the nation. Whereas the Jewish people, if you read it bold, it sounds like there's nothing in between. There's only God's direction, which of course would be a great, great benefit. But it isn't so simple. Because one of the places in the Gemara where this principle is derived is from a story. Shmuel was one of the great scholars of the Gemara, and he had a friend who was an idol worshiper. Yeah, he had a friend who was an idol worshiper. Such things can happen. Whose name was Ablat. And they were sitting together. A group of Jewish workers passed by on their way out to cut reeds in the forest, in the swamp. And on the way out, Ablat said of one of the Jews, he's not coming back. He's going to die there. And Shmuel said, not so. So they go out, several hours later they come back, and that Jew is walking on his 2 feet, comes back. So Shmuel calls him over and says to him, open up your sack into which you put the reeds that you cut. So he opens it up and empties it out, and in the sack there is a poisonous snake chopped in half by the cutting tool that the Jew had to cut the reeds. So Shmuel says to the Jew, did anything unusual happen to you during the day today? And the Jew says, well, here's our practice. We have lunch on the job. Everybody brings some food. They put it together in a common store. I'm in charge of that common store. And then I divide it out at lunchtime. There was a Jew who didn't bring anything today. I made as if he contributed something also, because I contributed double in his place. I made it look like he contributed something, so that when it came lunchtime, he too could eat. So Shmuel said, the verse tells us, "Tzedakah tatzil mimovis," charity saves from death. And he says, from here you see, ein mazel Yisrael. There's no mazel for the Jewish people. Now, Tosfos says, let's analyze a little bit what happened here. Ablat said he's not coming back, he's going to die. Was Ablat just wrong? Listen, Ablat, he's a Jew, right? All this is off the page. It has no relevance because there was a poisonous snake waiting for him, but there wasn't there. Rabbi wasn't just fantasizing. He saw that the Jew was in mortal danger, and he was right. So what the story teaches you is that there are forces which direct the lives of Jews also, but you can overcome them. You can overcome them. Ein mazel Yisrael doesn't mean nothing is involved. It means you can overcome what's involved because you're given the power to rise above it. This is epitomized in a famous incident in Abraham's life, which is written in the Torah itself. When God promises Abraham children, Abraham says to God, this is in the Midrash, Abraham says to God, but I see in the stars that it's decreed that I should not have children. God says to Abraham, step outside, look at the stars, and count them. If you can count them, those will be your children. Now, the word in Hebrew is habet hashamayma, gaze heavenward, but in Hebrew, lahabit means to look down. So from here, the Midrash says that God took Abraham above the stars. He said, look down upon the stars. You have the power to rise above the stars. That was the message to Abraham. You were wrong. God doesn't say to Abraham, go back to philosophy 101. You're a Jew. You're not part of that. The stars are for Goyim. They're not for you. No, he didn't tell him that. On the contrary. He said, yeah, you read the stars correctly, and they're relevant, but you can rise above it. Of course, you have to do something to rise above it. It's not guaranteed. It's not automatic. Then it would be that the stars have no relevance. No, they have relevance, but you can rise above it. So we say, Ein mazel Yisrael, it doesn't mean there aren't heavenly forces involved. It just means that they're not absolute. Yeah.
I don't know where I've heard it or what exactly it was, but I know there's certain things that we are controlled by mazel, even though we can rise above it. There's certain things that still control. Can you let me know what those are?
Yeah, Bani Chaim Mazoni, I think. Life, children, and support. But there are lots of other things that are involved in life that aren't like that. I mean, the point of the other nations is that they have this heavenly counterpart that's doing the whole job, number one, and also not something that you can overcome. So this would be a partial job, but right. Now, so that's that. Now comes the question of providence. Now here, I don't know, maybe I did this 6 weeks ago, so almost nobody here was there then. This idea of general providence and individual providence. This is such a complicated subject that there's a disagreement about whether or not there's a disagreement. That's how twisted it is. And there are different definitions of providence, so to do the job right would take us 2 months every day. I'm not going to do that. But I'll give you a general picture, at least so you can have some little understanding of what's going on. The raw idea of general individual providence would be something like this. Individual providence means you had a flat tire. God made the flat tire on this occasion specifically for you so as to have some impact on your life. Your investments went up. God wanted you to have that money. You, at this time, for your life, this much money coming through investments, not finding a purse, everything that happens to this person is because God decreed it for him on this occasion, for his taking into account the details of his life. General providence would be there's the seasons, and there's the stock market going up and down, and you're subject to the general fluctuations of human conditions, like everybody else, blind, irrespective of your individual actions or individual character, would have nothing to do with it. Be just like animals. Individuals will get individual providence because they're very great tzaddikim, very pious, very learned in Torah, very righteous. They would get individual providence. Nobody else gets it. That would be the one picture. It would be similarly that Michal is saying here that Jews get this kind of individual providence, but non-Jews do not. Now, this picture that I've just sketched to you is wrong. Capital W. I don't think that any believing Jew could accept it.
unless he's terribly confused or he's terribly prejudiced. Because the simple facts which we have reviewed up until now make it clear that that can't be the case. What about reward and punishment? For Jews and non-Jews. Your reward, your punishment depends upon your record, not anything else. And it's in detail. And as all the Sfarim say, let's take just punishment for a moment. Some crimes deserve to be punished in this world. Some crimes deserve to be punished in Gehenna, the entranceway to the next world. And some crimes deserve to be punished in both places, and each one is different. So obviously, what crime you commit determines what kind of punishment you should get. That's going to be done on a one-by-one basis. You can't be subject to the weather and to the stock market and to the COVID germs and just be willy-nilly involved, because then reward and punishment doesn't apply to you. And it does apply to you. Prayer. Prayer is something which God hears and answers, Jews or non-Jews. Maybe yes, positively or negatively, but it's there, and it's a tool and something that God encourages. So, and prayer depends upon who prays and what he prays and how he prays. So it's simply not possible to take the idea that some Jews are abandoned to the forces of nature like animals are. It's not conceivable. A question will be about animals also. That's another thing which I probably won't talk to you about. But certainly with respect to human beings, that can't be the distinction. So, the truth here is something which I heard on a recording from Rabbi Yaakov. When I want to name it, runs away. Weinberg. It was a Rosh Yeshiva in near Israel many years ago. And he distinguished between two concepts, two dimensions of providence. One is control, management, and causality, pushing things around, making things happen. Involvement in the occurrences in the world, that's one dimension. And the other dimension of providence is the purpose for which things happen. The goal of managing and manipulating and directing things. And the general picture is, as far as control and management and causality are concerned, everything is equal. Jews and non-Jews, and even things that aren't like animals and the rest, they're all equal. God is running the show, down to the tiniest detail. That's those words that I just said is a quotation from one sentence in the Guide of the Perplexed, Maimonides' philosophical work, down to the tiniest detail. But the purposes vary. Sometimes what happens to this individual is not for the sake of this individual at all. There's a purpose for a group, and this individual, what happens to it on this occasion is for the sake of the purpose for the group being realized. And as far as the purpose for the group being realized, it didn't have to be this individual, it could be another individual. For example, one of the purposes of providence is to make sure that the categories of items shouldn't go extinct. Now, some people translate the Hebrew word as species, but that confuses it with the modern biological concept of species, or rather, I should say, the modern biological concepts of species, because there are at least 10 different definitions of species, which biologists use opportunistically when they need them. Sexual reproduction is not the majority of things that there are on the planet. They're more bacteria than anything else, and they don't reproduce sexually. So, and so therefore, interbreeding or not interbreeding isn't going to work for bacteria, so that can't be the definition of species in bacteria. The word in Hebrew has nothing to do with the modern concepts of species. It's just categories. And the definition of the categories is not clear. Rashi and Chumash points out that the obvious types of definitions don't work. So I'm going to use the vague word categories. So now, let's just imagine that dogs form a category. Let's suppose God wants there to be dogs. Well,
If it's going to be dogs, there has to be regular reproduction. So God sets up a system whereby enough dogs reproduce over time to make sure that there'll be dogs. But whether it's this dog that reproduces or that dog that reproduces, vis-a-vis the purpose, makes absolutely no difference. So, God sets up a system whereby there's a system of causality, and the system of causality is guaranteed. The system of causality works with individuals, only individuals. The only thing you can push around is a clod of earth. The only thing you can push around is droplets of rain. The only thing you can push around is a dog to go this way or that way. Everything works with individuals. But it's set up in such a way that enough dogs will have circumstances that they will reproduce so that the category of dogs will not disappear. So the control, causality, management is on individuals, but the purpose is for the general. In the case of the non-Jewish world, the management, mostly the management of what happens to non-Jewish nations is a management to make sure that the nation will survive and the nation will be able to maintain its identity. But whether through this individual or that individual wouldn't matter. Of course, the conditions affect enough of this nation's citizens having livelihood and being able to reproduce and protect their children and so forth and so on. Whether it's this one or that one wouldn't matter. In the case of the Jewish people, the individual providence is much more detailed, because what they do is not just a matter of their own fidelity to God's word and fulfilling and then realizing their own spiritual potential. It's a matter of elevating and perfecting the world as a whole. So their actions have a much larger scope of significance, and therefore they have to be attended to and responded to in much greater detail. So the purpose of providence is different. Those people who will tell you that only great tzaddikim, great righteous, pious people have individual providence, so they're right and wrong. They're quoting an actual statement of the Ramban, an actual statement of the Rambam, part 3, chapter 18 in the guide. But the word providence there means a purpose, and the purpose is protection. If a person is a great tzaddik, he gets protection. The individual management of his life protects him. Other people don't get that kind of protection. It doesn't mean that God's is not involved in their lives. He's involved in setting up a system which pushes things around, but it pushes things around for the sake of other things. Yeah.
Do we have to say every situation will have the personal causality and purpose and also a general, or some cases only a personal and some cases only have a general purpose? Because if a situation happens to an individual in a group, it will have both a general purpose and a specific purpose on him. So do we have to say every situation is like that?
It's a good question. Whether every situation, there are two different aspects, and now he's asking, what about an individual person's life? Wouldn't there be some aspects of his life that would serve the general purpose, and some aspects of his life which would be managed in terms of his own individual life and record and projects? Let me think for a second. You see, the purpose of specific or individual providence seems to imply the general. Would there be something which would happen, let's say, to a Jew, only because of the general? Well, maybe. Okay, let me rephrase it just a little to make it easier to deal with. But the question is a good question. Let's talk about what happens to an individual. Is it just because of him individually, or is it because of his being a parent to that child, or a citizen of that city, or a neighbor to that person, or a teacher in that school, and so forth and so on, where were he not to have that function, it wouldn't have happened to him. It's only because of that. That's for sure true. That's for sure true. If Desta says that one of the understandings of 2 days of Rosh Hashanah is that on the first day you're judged in terms of your own record, and the second day you're judged in terms of how much others need you. And if your own personal record is shoddy, but other people need you, the second judgment can sway the ultimate outcome. So I think you're right. I think that that now, when you make a universal statement, that requires you to imagine all possibilities and close all the doors. I find that extremely difficult to do. So would it be every time? I don't know how, because there's always tricky ways to manipulate things and make one thing depend upon another so you can escape the general rule. I don't think it's an important issue either, whether it's every time or it's not every time. But it's certainly true that your relationships to other people even could be without your knowing and without your appreciating it. I'll tell you one story and then I'll quit. This is an exquisite story. There was this took place in Texas maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago. There was a shul that needed money to rebuild, and they made an advertisement. It was before GoFundMe, but still, that was the idea. And they got a check for $50,000 from a non-Jew living somewhere in Texas. Well, they were cautious about it. They didn't want to take any chances. They called the guy up, and they are you sure you got the address right? You understand that we're a Jewish religious organization, and so on and so on. Oh, yes, Rabbi, yes, sir. I understand it very well. Well, what impelled you to do this? Why are you doing this? Well, I'll tell you, Rabbi, I visited Jerusalem, and I went to the wall, and there was somebody there in a long coat and a pancake hat, and he was really pious, and he was really praying. It was so inspiring. It was so breathtaking. I thought to myself, if I can do something for these people, I'm going to do something for these people. And I came back here to Texas. I saw the advertisement. I thought, here's my chance. Here's my check. Okay, now, after 120, that Jew with the coat and the pancake hat is going to go up for a final judgment. And they're going to be piling up all of his good deeds on one side, all his bad deeds on the other side. And at a certain point, an angel's going to come in and put his foot down on the good side and say, this is for the contribution that you made for the building fund of that synagogue in Texas. Tex who? Tex what? What's Tex? What are you talking about? Yeah, because you inspired that non-Jew, and he was inspired to do something for the Jewish people, and it goes to your credit. He didn't even know about it, right? But it has an effect on him because of what happened through him. So it's, and he probably wasn't davening at that time, any different time, any other time that he would daven. But he was there. He made the impression, and that the good thing came into the world through him. So I think that what happens to an individual definitely depends in part on how he's related to everybody else. And whether every event plays both roles, I don't know. But the attention to the individual is much greater for Jewish people than for non-Jewish people. You had a question?
Well, yes. We could say that achieving specific perfections that soul requires is a way to, so to speak, overcome the mazel, because you had this mazel that forced you to actually achieve those specific perfections, and once you achieve those perfections, maybe you can actually overcome that mazel.
No, I don't see the perfections as coming from a mazel. Certainly not for the Jewish people. And even there, each soul is put into the world to conquer a specific part of your perfection. Now that you're saying this, I have to think about this now, because I don't know whether the souls of non-Jews do that job, whether they contribute to the final definition of humanity. I doubt it, but I don't know for sure. I don't know for sure whether they contribute to that. They are there because they are derivative of the original humanity, and they still do have free will, and they're there in part to give them the opportunity to elevate themselves and become Jewish. And in the interim, even if they don't do that, they have an effect on their own spirituality. But this project of perfecting the world and this project of creating the perfected humanity is, I think, within the concept of the nation. So they play, as he's a secondary role. They're there because they're in a world together with us, but that's all. If the world didn't have us in it, they couldn't play that role. They couldn't do it. So it's not a question of overcoming the mazel, and it has nothing to do with the perfection. The perfection that each person has to have is dictated by God Himself only, and no mazel would have the power or the wisdom to do that. It wouldn't be done through a mazel. It would not be done through a mazel.